An 8th U.S. service member has died, this time from a health-related incident. And tonight we have to ask, did Trump's envoys actually try to prevent this war from happening? What started as airstrikes has quickly and predictably expanded into a regional conflict. And according to NBC News, the president is seriously considering putting boots on the ground in Iran. And while this administration has spent billions building up the military, it simultaneously fired the people whose job it is to prevent wars from starting in the first place. Over 80 ambassador posts are vacant. Of the 14 countries where the State Department urged Americans to, quote, depart now in the early days of the war, only half had a confirmed U.S. ambassador. And while the Trump administration says they engaged in good faith negotiations with Iran, the reporting conflicts with the official story. According to Politico, the Iranians were reportedly confused that they were just dealing with Jared Kushner and Steve Witkoff. No nuclear technical experts or lawyers or career diplomats, just the president's son-in-law and a real estate developer who is one of the president's oldest friends. A Persian Gulf diplomat told MS Now the Iranian and the U.S. delegations met for only 4 to 5 minutes during the first rounds of talks this year. Not hours, 4 to 5 minutes, which is less time than it takes most missiles we fire to reach their targets. Joining us now is retired Brigadier General Mark Kemet, who also served as the State Department's Assistant Secretary of Political Military Affairs, and Suzanne Maloney, Vice President and Director of Foreign Policy at the Brookings Institute, who has also advised Republican and Democratic administrations on Iran. So, Suzanne, we had 3 rounds of talks during negotiations before this war started. And from what you understand, was a peaceful resolution ever really an option, or has this war been inevitable?
Well, I don't know that it was inevitable, but I do think that the negotiations were largely a dodge. They were an attempt by the president to stall for time so that he could continue to move assets out to the region to make good on the commitments that he made to the Iranian people when he posted on social media back in January that the United States would come to their rescue. I also think the Iranians recognized that they probably weren't going to get very much out of this negotiating process. It had really come out of nowhere. And they recognized that back in June, in the run-up to the 12-day war, the United States sought to essentially dupe them by scheduling negotiations, even as they were preparing for the Israeli and then the U.S. attack on Iran. And so this time around, I think the Iranians recognized that that was, if not inevitable, it was a very high likelihood.
General, I'm curious to get your thoughts as we learn about the tragic news of 2 more service members dying over the course of the last week during this war. That brings the total to 8, and now we're getting some reports that President Trump is not ruling out the idea of putting boots on the ground. And immediately, I think a lot of people who follow this are really worried about mission creep, no clear objective, realizing that perhaps the objectives that the president is giving the soldiers is one that is constantly shifting or moving from, one target to the other, whether it's nuclear disarmament or regime change, or now possibly seizing oil fields and uranium, enriched uranium in Iran. How do you read the news that the president is open to the idea of having boots on the ground, and what pitfalls are you worried about if that does happen?
Well, I think the most important thing is to understand that the Iranians, have 400 kilograms of enriched uranium, and that doesn't necessarily need to be turned into a nuclear bomb. It can be used as a dirty bomb that would be relatively simple to put on one of those ballistic missiles that have been doing such damage to the region. So I don't think we can underestimate the challenges that those loose nukes or that loose material presents. Look, one thing I would say, one is always in a bad position to try to argue Susan Maloney because of her smarts and her background. But the fact remains is one of those arguments, 5 minutes of negotiations, well, we certainly understand that most of that was proximity talks, which is a normal type of negotiations that was done by the Iranians. But the fact remains is those negotiations were going the same direction which the Obama negotiations did, which is the first thing the Iranians do is say, we're going to take proxies off the table, we're going to take ballistic missiles off the table, and we're only going to talk about the finest details about the nuclear program. I think the biggest problem is that President Trump realized that the Iranians were only willing to sign the same agreement that President Obama did in 2016. And with that frustration, he saw that as a reason to protect America from a nuclear weapon. And unfortunately, he went to war to do it.
I just got to say, General, though, the Omani foreign minister said that it was a better deal that the Iranians were willing to sign this time around. I mean, they said that they were willing to completely stop enriching uranium for 3 to 5 years, which would have been the term of the remainder of President Trump's term. So there was some suggestion that the Iranians were willing to offer at least a better deal than JCPOA, the Obama deal.
Well, look, I've worked with mediators quite often, and mediators are always going to try to put the happy talk out there. We would have had a long way to go to get a 3 to 5 year suspension. And even so, that would mean when another president came in, they could just try to stall that along. I think anybody that does not believe the Iranians were on a path to a nuclear weapon as a means of defending their country has not understood what the North Koreans did.
Suzanne, Trump posted on Truth Social just now about oil prices, saying, quote, short-term oil prices, which will drop rapidly when the destruction of the Iran nuclear threat is over, is a very small price to pay for USA and world safety and peace. Only fools would think differently. President DJT. You know, we've gotten a lot of mixed messages about what this war is about. Is it about nukes? Is it about regime change? Is it about anything else? And now it seems like the argument that has been made, if not only by Trump, but by his surrogates, his allies, other members of the administration, is that this is maybe an energy play, that we are, in fact, trying to take more oil from Iran in the same way that the president sees the adventurism in Venezuela as successful because we got Venezuela's oil. If that is the objective here, how do you think that plays out?
Well, I think you point to a really important issue, which is that President Trump has not made a clear case to the American people or to Congress about precisely what our objectives are and what end state we're trying to advance in Iran with our military action. There are all kinds of concerns about the behavior of the Iranian regime, its pursuit of nuclear weapons, its use of proxies to threaten and terrorize its neighbors, its repression and horrific violence toward its own people. Those are all ongoing concerns and very legitimate concerns. But the president hasn't explained how he intends to accomplish whatever his objectives might be. And because the narrative seems to be changing, originally talked about regime change, a number of other senior officials talked about eroding Iran's ballistic missile capabilities. There's now talk about putting boots on the ground to try to secure the enriched uranium that could be used for a dirty bomb or a weapon at some point in the future. And of course, there is concern, and there seems to be some talk from the administration that having access to Iran's energy resources, potentially by taking Kharg Island, which is the venue through which 90% of their exports flow, would be an asset for the United States in the same way that the president was able to leverage Venezuelan oil after his operation there. I think this is a very mixed set of messages, and particularly as Americans are dying, we should be very clear about what we're trying to accomplish and what it's going to do for American security and international security.
General, I'm wondering if we can go back to some of what you were discussing with Ayman, just about the prospect of service members actually, having to put their boots on the ground in Iran. A lot of people have been drawing comparisons between what this administration is trying to do there and what we saw happen in Venezuela. But the reality is Iran is very, very different than Venezuela. Massive country, very mountainous, complex terrain. If we were to get to that point, how complex, how devastating could that be for American men and women sent to actually fight on the ground there?
Well, first of all, I don't think anybody is anticipating a force on the ground similar to what we did in Iraq, either in the first Gulf War or the second Gulf War. It'd be a tough mission, and I'm really upset that people are talking about this. But we do have highly specialized small units that specialize in taking care of hard and deeply buried targets, and that's what I think he would define as boots on the ground. But I agree with Suzanne that the messaging has been terrible, and let me propose an end state. An end state and a policy should be that we accomplish on the battlefield what we are unable to accomplish at the negotiating table, which is to compel the Iranians to come back to the negotiating table at a very high cost, but work out the three primary issues, and only those three primary issues, which we were talking about at the negotiating table, which is the nuclear program, the ballistic missile program, and the proxy program. All this other stuff should be, and quite frankly, is noise, whether we're talking about regime change, whether they're talking about oil, all of this is noise.
General Mark Kimmitt and Suzanne Maloney, great to have you both. Thank you.